those who don't know me, and for those who do know me, nice to see you. Hope your fall's going off swimmingly, or having a great start. And I'm doing a program, I've been doing the program, but this year is kind of an important time in music history, American history. It's the centennial of Rhapsody in Blue, which George Gershwin wrote in 1924, and it was premiered by Gershwin himself at the piano at what's called Aeolian Hall, which is where I believe Town Hall is located in New York City on West 44th Street, with Paul Whiteman and his symphonic jazz band behind him and performing this piece. So it's kind of an important work for American music, the beginning of the American sound, American popular music, the birth of jazz, all kind of like a meteor, all came at the right time for George Gershwin, who was this young man who came from immigrant parents, Russian Jewish immigrant parents who fled from persecution through Ellis Island, entry point, and raised their 4 children in Brooklyn, and then moved to the Lower East Side. So we'll have a couple of video clips just to so that you get to know him, and I think by, I've had this feedback, when you get this kind of information, you hear the music differently, it connects with you differently, maybe you relate to some of these stories also in some ways. And we'll show a little brief documentary on Gershwin himself. But I wanted to start off one of his big pieces that he wrote. He never felt adequate, even though he was a success in the 1920s as a Broadway musical theater songwriter and also a composer. So he set off, through the recommendation of his colleagues, to go to Europe, in particular Paris, where in the 1920s, a lot of composers and musicians flocked to, and artists. One particular teacher was recommended, Nadia Boulanger. Do you know who this person is? Yes. Okay. She's she would be the pedagogue of all pedagogues, probably considered the greatest music pedagogue of the 20th century. She taught musicians and composers such as Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein, Quincy Jones, Burt Bacharach, the great Argentine composer Astor Piazzolla, and the list is a scroll of about 600 well-known composers all over the world that she has been the teacher of. So he goes and visits her one day in Paris. He stays there for about 9 months, a year, because it was an opportunity for him to travel and meet other composers whom he admired and musicians. And so he saw Nadia Boulanger, who greeted him with warmth and said, "I'd be happy to teach you, but I think I would ruin you as a composer because you are already established. You already have your own way of writing, style. So, but if you really want to see somebody, go see Stravinsky, Igor Stravinsky. Do you know who Igor Stravinsky is? Yes. Well, if you don't, just imagine a 6'4", skinny, older man with a pencil mustache, monocle glasses, and a cigarette holder that went all the way out to here with ashes hanging out. Very kind of brooding Russian composer. And he goes to see Stravinsky, to whom this 27-year-old Gershwin asks for lessons. And Stravinsky says, "Well, I'll be happy to teach you." He says, "But George, I just want to ask you one question. How much do you make as a composer?" George, who was very embarrassed to talk about this money and all that to somebody he admired, said, "Well, it all depends every year. But I can make anywhere from $150,000 to $250,000. Okay, this is 1927. So almost a century ago, he was making that amount. So we're talking in the millions. To which the elder statesman looked at George and said, "Well, George, perhaps you should teach me." Nothing happened with Gershwin and Stravinsky with studying. But Gershwin did learn a lot while he was in Paris. And Paris is very much like New York, the hustle bustle, the beautiful, the city of lights, the cabs, the black cabs that they have, honking, and all this craziness that goes on. And yet there's this great, beautiful, romantic backdrop of the city. So that inspired him to write his first orchestral piece, because he really wasn't trained at all as a musician or composer, formally trained. And wrote his first piece called An American in Paris, loosely based on his own adventures there. So I will play a piano version, excerpts of this orchestral work. I better make sure my phone's off. have a 5-minute little brief documentary about George Gershwin. Oops, wrong one. Okay. Third time's the charm. Oh. Let's see if that's. Here we go. Can everyone hear? Yes? No.
George Gershwin was born in Brooklyn, New York.
Let's start it again.
Before long, George was playing his own songs at the publishing house, which made his employer quite unhappy. He moved. George Gershwin was born in Brooklyn, New York on September 26, 1898. His parents were Russian Jewish immigrants who moved to New York in the 1890s. When George was a young child, he wasn't interested in becoming a musician, but he did love to listen to ragtime music. He liked sitting outside the clubs in Harlem, taking in the sounds of jazz. He was a spirited boy who was very social and loved to roller skate, play street hockey, stickball, and baseball. He had a reputation for being the best roller skater in the neighborhood. Later, he met a violinist named Max Rosen who introduced him to classical music. His parents bought his brother Ira a used piano. Ira didn't care for it, but George loved it. His first piano teachers were not challenging enough for George, so he started taking lessons from Charles Hambitzer. His new teacher tried to convert George's musical interest to classical music, but George remained faithful to the popular music he loved. His father, who was a businessman, enrolled George into a business school, but he quit when he was 15 to pursue his own career. In 1913, he got a job as a plugger at the Remix Publishing Company. His job was to promote the publisher's music by playing it on the piano so others could hear it. During this era, there was no radio, and most people did not own a record player. So they relied on piano players to introduce the new songs to the people in show business. Later, he started taking lessons from Edward Kiley, who was a violinist. Edward taught George the art of composition based on the European standards. He also taught him how to orchestrate music. Before long, George was playing his own songs at the publishing house, which made his employer quite unhappy. He moved to the Harms Publishing Company, who agreed to publish his songs. It was a win-win situation. The customers liked his songs, and his outgoing personality and the publishing house flourished. One day, he met a man named Irving Caesar who wanted to write a song with George. In one afternoon, they created the song Swanee, which Al Jolson made famous.
Swanee, how I love you, my dear old Swanee.
He sold over 2 million copies and was suddenly rich and famous at the young age of 19. George's songs were exciting and new. He wanted to represent America, and it was this time that he Americanized his last name from Gershwin to Gershwin. A man named George White wanted to produce some new and exciting Broadway musicals to compete with the Ziegfeld Follies. So he hired George and his brother Ira to write the songs for his shows, which were referred to as the Scandals. George and Ira's songs were an instant success. Americans loved the new sounds of fascinating rhythm and the man I love. George and his brother became a team. They worked extremely well together. The brothers enjoyed painting in their spare time and even lived next door to each other. George's life revolved around music. He would play piano for parties, then come home and compose. He dated many glamorous women, but never married. He said he was too busy. He also enjoyed playing golf and tennis and kept himself physically fit. The one rule he broke was smoking cigars, which he did quite often. Paul Whiteman, a jazz band leader, wanted to legitimize jazz as important American music. He planned to do this by hosting a concert. He asked George to write a piece that combined jazz and symphonic music. George took him up on this challenge and started writing the composition while on a train. The musical piece that resulted was Rhapsody in Blue. He was often inspired by the sounds that were around him. Though the concert itself was criticized for being boring, the audience loved Rhapsody in Blue, and it brought instant fame to George around the world. Before he could take his bows after his first one.
Stop right there. It gives you a bit of an idea of George, bringing him to life a little bit more. As you saw, he worked for a music publishing house on West 28th Street between 5th and 6th, which they called Tin Pan Alley at that time. It's the beginning of musical theater and Broadway. And his job was to basically arrange music upstairs, where they had all the song arrangers frantically writing stuff, the latest songs that were hits. They would start writing publications, sheet music for it right away. And downstairs is where they sold the sheet music. They had a music store, and so people off the streets from Broadway, vaudeville, amateur musicians would come out, grab sheet music, and ask George, who was 15 years old, he dropped out of high school, and started working right away. There would be a tiny little piano, and he would just plug out, as they said, song plugger. He would plug out the song for the person. They could try it out and see if they'd like to buy it, you know. So he did that for 3 years until he hit his big break with Swanee. So I'm going to play you a couple of his earlier works while he was in the publishing house as he's developing his craft and his style of music. This is called 3/4 Blues, the first tune. It's in the style of the blues sound, although it's in three. His brother Ira said it sounded more like an Irish waltz than the blues. Second tune is called Impromptu in 2 Keys. It was originally written as a song for one of their shows in the 1920s. However, they scratched that out of the show, and George rewrote it as a piano solo piece, and that's how it was published. And it's about playing the right hand melody in one key, and then the left hand accompanying the melody in a different key. So it has a bit of a clashy sound, and maybe we're used to hearing that now, but this is a century ago that he's coming up with new sounds and ideas, that this kind of represented maybe the modern American city feel and vibe that he was trying to create. So that's the second tune, and then I will, the third of the set, I'll play Swanee, which was his big hit, and he and Irving Caesar were just walking down Broadway talking about, let's write something that's, you know, novelty-like, trending right now, and went to his apartment near Times Square, and they wrote it in like 10 minutes, supposedly, from what Irving Caesar said. They didn't think anything of it until Al Jolson asked George, "Can I record it?" And he said, "Sure." And that's how it all began. So here we go. Caught in that documentary, when he hit the big time with Swanee, he quit his job, even though he's still making a good living. He was making more money than his father, who had many businesses going on at this time. He wanted to be on Broadway, and so he asked his brother Ira, who was at Columbia University at the time, majoring in English, to join him as his lyricist. So Ira said, "Sure, why not?" It'll be fun, right? These are a bunch of early 20-year-old young men, you know, and Broadway and all of this new stuff that was happening with jazz. The birth of jazz was very exciting, and I think for young adults, I think that's what they wanted to be part of. So they were exclusively pretty much the writing team for the next 12 years. And as you also may have heard, that when his parents came, their name was Gershwin, actually. And the father changed it when he came to New York and legally to Gershwin with a V. And then later when George hit the big time, he changed his name from Jakob Gregor Gershwin to George Gershwin. So, yeah, because I guess Jakob Gregor Gershwin didn't quite have that Broadway ring at the time. It does now. But a lot of musicians changed their name. Al Jolson is Yale Olson or something like this. That's his name. Irving Berlin is Israel Beilin. Vladimir Dukelski is not Vladimir Dukelski, but Vernon Duke, who wrote April in Paris, another great song. So a lot of them were changing their name. Why? Because they were of immigrant parents at that time, and they wanted to be part of the American fabric and also bring this kind of American sound that they thought this was at this time, contribute in that way through music. The 20s were full of musicals that they were writing exclusively, the Gershwins. And though you don't see any revivals of these musicals, all the songs that you're familiar with by the Gershwins are timeless classics. They seem to stand still in time. And younger generations today are still singing their music because they're still timely. Even though some of the words may not be used, it's about the sophistication, about people of that time in the 1920s, as they called it, the Roaring 20s. So I'd like to play a couple of piano arrangements of those songs. The Man I Love, which originally was called The Girl I Love, but it didn't quite work somehow, I think, with the audience. So 4 years later, they changed the title, and somehow it caught on. And they sold 100,000 copies, I think, within 6 weeks, just from that little decision. The other tune is called Fascinating Rhythm, and I was going to ask, because later on I was going to talk about the way people spoke at that time. There were a lot of slangs that we still use today that they did a century ago, but does anyone know what a flivver is? Flivver. F-L-I-V-V-E-R. Huh?
$5.
$5? That's a pretty good guess. Yeah, right. Well, Fascinating Rhythm, just to give you the first line of the lyrics. Fascinating rhythm, you got me on the go, fascinating rhythm, I'm all a quiver. What a mess you're making, the neighbors want to know why I'm always shaking, just like the flivver. The flivver is the sound motor of the Model T Fords back in the day. It had that humming sound. It's cute, right? Anyways. great arrangement by Earl Wild. He was a classical pianist, but supposedly he hid his talent of being an improviser. And one day he, just a little side story, he was playing with, in the NBC Symphony Orchestra in the 1940s or 50s under Arturo Toscanini as the pianist in the orchestra. And he just noodled during a break. He just started playing this kind of arrangements, all kinds of stuff. And then the next studio over was Sid Caesar putting on his show, their show of shows. And he heard him and he asked Earl Wild to be a skit pianist, write all of his music or improvise all his music for all of his skits there. And that's how he developed it. And someone said, write this stuff down. This is great, you know, for pianists, especially me, not a great improviser or a jazz musician. So it's really nice to have that in a program and to also display the beautiful songs of Gershwin. But Gershwin set out in the 1920s to also write serious music. I mean, after all, if you saw the documentary, he was trained by well-noted classical European composers and musicians. And he had this idea. He had this book that he used to write all of his musical ideas, thoughts, you know, rhythms, melodies, just little, you know, bits that would someday all kind of make sense and come together like a story. He was going to set out to do 24 preludes, kind of like the Chopin 24 preludes, little short pieces that kind of just give you a little idea of each one, like a little vignette. And his life was cut short, unfortunately, at age 37. He had died, you know, from a brain tumor, and never had that opportunity. But we were able to preserve 6 of those preludes that he wrote, and they're published now through Warner Brothers. And I'm going to play 3 of them. Each of them was described by a New York music reviewer when he first heard Gershwin debut them at the Roosevelt Hotel, their Grand Central Station, in 1926. To him, the reviewer said it was like little vignettes of New York City life. And so the first one's kind of like the early jazz music that you might hear, the syncopation, offbeat rhythms of early jazz in the 1920s. The second tune is in the style of the American blues, has a lullaby kind of left-hand accompaniment that constantly is going up and down, back and forth, while you have this beautiful blues melody line. Precursor to his song Summertime, perhaps, maybe. And then the last one is like a Spanish kind of prelude with a Latin tinge. It's got jagged, rugged kind of rhythms and angles. But they're all very virtuosic, and it's completely changing the way pianists played from the European tradition, because he, again, never took any formal training. He never went to a music school. Everything he learned, he just learned kind of, he was a street musician. He learned everything on the streets and learned from the best. So I will play those 3 preludes. So the 1920s, what's so great about the 1920s? The roaring 20s after World War I opened up the economy, and especially in the United States. I mean, Europe was decimated and they had to rebuild, but the US was thriving. The middle class was growing, becoming the majority. People had money to spend. Job employment was 1.4%. 1 in 4 homeowners owned a car, which built infrastructure, highways, streets. All of a sudden, we're living in a modern society now in the 1920s. People live frivolously, you know? You go out and have dinner, buy gifts, go to the movies, go to a supper club, go to the theater, go to a concert now, have a car. They even had refrigerators. You can buy a refrigerator now, and a vacuum cleaner. No more beating those rugs, right? Yeah, this is changing. This is a game changer in a century ago. And so this becomes a way of the culture, the beginning of consumerism and the beginning of sophistication, because now you're owning things. You own a home, you have a job, you have these nice luxury goods, you know. And the Gershwins had their finger on the pulse. They used the words that were being used at that time. If you watch old black and white films from the 30s and 40s, you know that kind of fast talking, that was going on. So in the 1920s, what was biggest, one of the biggest game changers was the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote.
Yay.
Yeah, and while men were a little more enthusiasm.
All right,
We've come a long way since then, right? Yeah, but I mean, it was a major breakthrough because during World War I, while millions of young soldier men were going to war, women, who were doing the jobs? Women. And that gave them independence now. There was no more of the tradition. So they had their own money, they had their own place, and then there was this new wave of the new reinvention of womanhood called the flappers. You remember that expression? They were the true women who had the bobbed hairdo, the short skirts above the knees, the dangling cigarette with the painted lips, hanging out at speakeasies and clubs and bars with interested male suitors all hanging by, waiting, you know, kind of thing. So they kind of were calling the shots. It was a different time for society. Society was changing, shifting at this time. Great inventions were happening at this time. The first airmail carrier flying in 1924. We were already getting postal mail from New York to California and everything in between. Technology, IBM was founded in 1924. General Motors, of course, had started in the early 1900s, at the very beginning of 1900s, with the Model T Fords, the first car, consumer car. You know how much it cost? Model T Fords in the 1920s, by 1927? Too expensive. Yeah. $20? I don't know where you can get it. Might as well go up. Did I hear 450? 250? Pretty cool. You're both kind of in the middle. It was about 300 by the time 1927 came around. But prior to that, when it first came out in 1908, it was $850. But as consumers in the middle class could afford money, they brought the price down so they'd have more people buying the cars. So very interesting. What else was there? The advent of the talkies, Hollywood movie in 1927. We had motion pictures with sound. Prior to that, we had silent movies with captions underneath. That was a big deal. And the first film that was shown in New York City was the jazz singer Al Jolson. That's right. And what else? Oh, well, if you're a sports fan, baseball was becoming a big, popular sport in America, so Yankee Stadium was being built. Although you're from Long Island, so I guess most of you are Mets fans? No. No, not really. Okay. Yeah, I'm caught in the middle because I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm a Dodgers fan, and right now they're at Citi Field playing the Mets. And when I came here at the college, I was a Mets fan. So I'm in a dilemma right now here. But baseball was popular, so they built Yankee Stadium. The first transatlantic nonstop flight from Roosevelt Field in New York to, I believe it was Paris, somewhere in France. Who was the guy who flew it? Kurt, right. But did you know a year later, Amelia Earhart did the same thing? Yeah. By this time in the 1920s, we had, and the passing of giving women the right to vote. Within a short time, we had 2 women governors from Wyoming and Texas in office in the 1920s. Yeah, so I mean the list goes on and on. The Museum of Modern Art opens its doors at the end of 1929, so we're entering modernism, you know, out of the kind of the influences of European culture and now establishing American things. Yeah, we were becoming a brand. I mean, commercially, you know, pop music was very popular. It was an export, you know, and goods that were being manufactured here were all in demand. So it was a very, I'm sure, very interesting time for most, I guess, not for all. But they knew what was going on. They heard the chatter and they used all these wonderful words like flivver. Maybe you know, like, what's that? Some we use, some we don't. How about that's a lot of baloney.
Yeah.
You still use that here? Yeah. That's a lot of baloney? All right, or if you're in agreement with someone, and how? Everybody use and how? Okay. Somebody keeps you the creeps. He gives me the willies, or she gives me the heebie-jeebies. Right? Cat's meow. Remember that one? Something terrific, or you know, you like somebody, you're the cat's meow kind of thing. Now we use amazing. Everyone seems to be using the word amazing. What else? Cup of Joe, Java. They used that. That was coined back then. Yeah. Swanky. When we go to see Swanky, I'm taking you out. And baby, the word I'm taking out for dinner, baby, kind of thing. That was used back then. Sophistication, right? Everything's kind of like a different life for people at that time. So anyways, I was going to show you another video. I'm trying to manage the time at the same time. This is, as I was talking about the 1920s, the 30s were different. It's like the opposite with the Great Depression. all of a sudden, within a decade, everyone went the other way through the stock market crash. And so the 1930s brought things that were more American. You weren't getting luxury goods or things from Europe or elsewhere overseas. Now you were manufacturing more at home. American fashion was becoming popular, using actresses like Betty Davis, Hedy Lamarr, all of them to advertise American fashion designers. Detective books, people would have to stay home. If you didn't have money, you would find ways to amuse yourselves. Monopoly, the game Monopoly was invented in the 1930s. Detective books, Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler, these names, they were all becoming very popular, reading these detective books. And so the 30s were a different time, and because of, thank God, with the talkies of the movie motion picture sound, a lot of Hollywood movies were making happier movies, you know, with dancing and singing and all that. So I'm going to show you, Gershwin was asked to come to Hollywood and write film scores, because they were churning them out with, you know, with all the wonderful spectacles, and it was basically bringing Broadway to Hollywood screen, right? And so he was writing something, and he was finishing up in 1937. Just before he passed away, he finished up the Shall We Dance with Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, whom he worked with Fred Astaire on Broadway in New York in the 1920s with Fred Astaire's sister, Adele. So it's funny that they would start on Broadway and then they'd end up in Hollywood together again. So this is a little short clip of his music in the background, and it's so perfectly matched with this kind of parading of people on a yacht, luxury liner, with people with their dogs walking. So it's called Walking the Dog Scene. So I don't know, I thought it was cute. But the music is really quite interesting, how he puts it all together to fit the scene. Let me see if I can find that. Here we go. Or Shall We Dance?
I tried every way, but nobody in Paris seemed to know you. And
everybody in Paris knows Linda Keane. Everybody worth knowing.
Of course, but I just don't seem to know the right people. Yeah. do something about that right now, as one Yankee to another?
I'm from the South.
Maybe you all should know.
Funny dogs have an instinct. They're like people.
How do you like that?
So I'm going to play 3 more tunes before we end with Rhapsody in Blue. Start with Summertime, a short version of Summertime. In the 1930s, Gershwin and his brother Ira were on a project. Gershwin was one of his personal projects to write a folk opera. And he wrote Porgy Bess, and it was premiered in 1935, yes. And it was the first time they had an all African-American cast. And if you catch there's a documentary where they actually interviewed the cast members of that performance, and they could tell you just nothing but great things about Gershwin, and how he did try to capture the essence of African-American songs, you know, the spirituals, the blues, in this music. But it wasn't meant to be authentic, but it was a means to the end of kind of promoting, and not promoting, but kind of showing the world what was going on in another part of the country in the 1930s in the South, particularly with the Jim Crow laws, which led a lot of African Americans without opportunity, restricted from opportunity to own a home, to get a job, to move to the big cities. And through going to these big cities, where jazz and Broadway musicals and pop music was becoming the thing, they incorporated a lot of the music that was coming from the South, the folk, the spirituals, the blues, all different regional blues music. And so then we have this fusion of great music that's happening in the big cities. So anyways, that's where he was inspired, and finally wrote this folk opera, the music for it. And of course, of all the tunes that you hear in there, this is the most recognizable, and it's become a jazz standard till this day, since then. So Summertime. to play this tune in the Rhapsody in Blue. This tune was probably his last song Gershwin wrote. That movie you saw, Shall We Dance, in 1937. Shortly after, he was on to another project, another film, when in his Beverly Hills apartment home, he collapsed and hemorrhage, had a brain hemorrhage. So they sent him to the hospital. He was in surgery for 4 or 5 hours, but never came out of it. Was in a coma for the remainder of that surgery. So he was posthumously nominated for Best Original Song for an Oscar. This song that he wrote was never titled or never completed, but he did ask his brother Ira to put words to it, which Ira didn't do at that time, I guess, and just somehow they got busy, you know how things are. And then one day during the service, where Gershwin is laid to rest in Westchester Hill Cemetery in upstate New York, after the service, Ira, who was just distraught, I mean, and even years later, he still was just, you know, just feeling this grief of his younger brother passing away. The words came to him to write this song finally, and it's called Our Love Is Here to Stay. And that's what he did, sort of a homage or a dedication to his younger brother. This is a wonderful arrangement by a colleague of mine named Hugh Sam. We both teach at the same school in the East Village, and he's a wonderful composer and also a wonderful arranger. And he loves Gershwin as much as I do. So. we'll end with Rhapsody in Blue. And Gershwin, as you may have heard in the documentary, he had no idea he was going to write it. He had some encountered chance meetings with Paul Whiteman, the jazz band leader and conductor, but he didn't think that he was going to be writing something for the next performance. Paul Whiteman was putting together a series of concerts called An Experiment in Modern Music, and featuring new composers, particularly American composers. And in this particular night, February 12th, 1924, at Aeolian Hall, George was supposed to write this piece for Paul Whiteman, and he only knew about it a month before. His brother Ira said, "Did you read it in the paper? You were supposed to write this piece." And he said, "Oh my God." So he wrote it in 2 weeks. Yeah. So you would have thought it would have been a disaster, and it may have had mixed reviews. I think overall, the audience loved it. From classical musicians like Jascha Heifetz to Igor Stravinsky were in the audience, applauding him on, and seeing that George was able to, just maybe subconsciously, able to write American music or a sound that bridged both the classical world and the popular jazz world together in his Rhapsody in Blue. And it's got that edge at times. It's got the beautiful romantic skyline scene that you might see of New York. All the winding streets, all the interesting streets, how they change from one block to the next. And you walk still to this day, even though they're building all these modern skyscrapers. There's some old history in a lot of places still left in New York City. And so I think he was influenced by all of that, and all kind of wrapped into one piece. And you'll hear all this wonderful string of melodies and rhythms that kind of get you that feeling of city life of New York City. And when asked after the concert, George Gershwin, "How did you write this piece? What inspired you to write it?" He said, "I don't know, but I think I heard it in the heart of noise. I heard music in the heart of noise." So I don't know. We'll see. You let me know if this sounds like noise or sounds like Rhapsody in Blue music. But thank you all for coming. This has been so great for you to come out. And thank you, Sean. Thank you, South Country Library. I do have a mailing list. If you want to find out more of concerts, I'll be in Long Island or in the Hamptons. Have some CDs if you're interested. Some Gershwin songs are there. And I'd love to just have a chat with you. Come say hello afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you.